As the November midterm elections get closer, there is a rising number of election-denying candidates who are winning their primary races and moving forward to November. According to States United Action, there are at least 26 deniers running for governor in 15 states, 15 people running for attorney general in 12 states, and 20 candidates in 16 states eyeing the position of Secretary of State, positions that typically oversee, of course, elections at the state level and the federal elections as well. Here to talk more about the impact of election deniers in politics is David Levine, an elections integrity fellow at Alliance for Securing Democracy. Good morning to you, sir. Thanks for giving us a few minutes.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
I want to read this little nugget from the Washington Post here. Among winning candidates for positions that have a role in the election certification process, 54 of 87 are election deniers. Should we be concerned?
Absolutely. One election denier is too many, let alone 54. You mentioned at the outset, secretaries of state, many of whom are chief state election officials. These are the folks that set the rules. They count the votes. They defend the will of the people. And in 2020, we saw a sitting president try and overturn a legitimate election. And one of the main reasons that person didn't succeed was because we saw state and local election officials across the political spectrum throughout the country that upheld the will of the voters. And that's what's on the line right now.
The Post goes on to say, after revealing that number, and I think that's the crux of what you're getting at, referring to those 54, had those candidates held power in 2020, they would have had the electoral clout to try something that the current office holders refused, overturning the vote and denying Joe Biden the presidency. A lot has been, rightfully so, a lot of attention has gone to the idea of who can cast a ballot. The voting restrictions that have been put in place across various states since 2020. But you can make the argument, or I'd like to ask you about the argument, not just the casting of ballots, but now we're at a phase of this thing where it seems that the counting and the certifying of the ballots may be as, if not more, important in the midterms and especially in 24.
I think that's absolutely right, Rob. Prior to the 2020 election cycle, we had a history where we might fight over the rules of an election. But once the election was underway, people across the political spectrum followed those rules. And 2020, unfortunately, threw that out the window, right? We saw the sitting president asked the Georgia Secretary of State to find additional votes that didn't exist to try and overturn the results of that election. And we, of course, have seen states that have passed laws based on false narratives about the 2020 election that not only unduly restrict access to the ballot, but make it more possible to interfere in the administration of the elections, including the counting of the ballots. And so I would say that the biggest threat that we face right now are efforts to interfere with the administration of the elections, whether it's laws being passed to interfere with the counting, or frankly, the unprecedented threats that we see being aimed squarely at our election officials, who frankly continue to do yeoman's work in a really challenging environment.
That is such a sobering answer, but an honest assessment. So if you're concerned about this issue, as obviously you are, or you live in a state where you're concerned about what future elections may bring or the integrity of those elections, what can you do practically?
Sure. Well, I think a couple things are, really important. We saw democracy bend but not break in 2020. And I think the way to ensure that our democracy continues to go forward is to make sure that everybody is an active participant. That begins with making sure you continue to vote, and making sure that you're mindful of who is running for office that will ensure that elections are run in a free and fair manner, right, regardless of the outcome. Number two, you should be seeking or looking to try and ensure that the election process continues to be accurate and fair. And one key way to do that is to try and serve as an election worker. We just had Poll Worker Day in August, but there continue to be efforts by state and local election officials to try and find election workers. These are the folks that serve on the front lines without whom we wouldn't be able to run elections. So try and look for opportunities to be a poll worker. And if you don't want to be a poll worker, consider being an election observer where you can monitor the process and see just how well run elections are across much of America. It is really important at this juncture that everybody is doing their part to help ensure that American elections continue to be free and fair going forward.
It's scary when you look ahead a little bit where we are. And I think we've learned that had Bill Barr or Mike Pence or Brad Raffensperger been different kind of men, we don't know how things would have turned out at the height of things in 2020. Before we let you go, when you look ahead a little bit to what is happening, Pennsylvania, Arizona, there's a list of states right now. Do you think that, and I know this phrase can be melodramatic and overused, but I think it's applicable here. If some of these problems are allowed to go on, and if we really do witness challenges and odd things happening in 2024, what's the likelihood, do you think, that we are actually headed for some kind of constitutional crisis for the presidential election of 2024 with some of these people who are now not only ascending to power, but some of whom, let's face it, are going to win and become governor and become a Secretary of State?
You know, 2024 is obviously a couple of years away. I mean, my attention right now is really focused on 2022. We nearly had a constitutional crisis, of course, in 2020. That remains a concern. But we do have checks and balances in people, as you alluded to before, that continue to try and do the right thing. And I have been heartened to see election officials across the political spectrum continue to run, solid elections, particularly considering all the challenges they're dealing with. And of course, we continue to see efforts at the local, state, and federal levels to try and move the ball forward, right? There seem to be bipartisan efforts on Capitol Hill to try and amend the Electoral Count Act. That's important. We've seen a number of states that have taken measures to try and ensure that their election processes are accessible and more secure. And we continue to see local election officials doing everything they can with the limited resources that they have to try and ensure that our elections, again, are free and fair. And so, I'm a glass half full kind of guy, and I believe that if we give our election officials the resources that they need, and we don't interfere with what they're trying to do, that we will continue to have free and fair elections going forward. But we do need to be good partners and good stewards of democracy alongside them to help ensure that happens.
If they're not interfered with. And I think folks who are not glass half full say that's a mighty big if, considering the rhetoric that we're hearing and the kinds of people that are getting very close to influential positions that could directly affect the election. That's a mighty big if, David. We'll leave it there for now. This issue is going nowhere. Please come back, and thank you for your work and your voice on this issue. We certainly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.